Only $4,000 for this month's allowance? What's this about? I told you to make it $6,000. I'm sorry, but your son, Robert, has passed away, so there won't be any more allowances. What? What are you talking about? There's $4,000 here.
I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. My husband, Robert, took his own life.
No way. Is it true? When?
It was about a week after you last spoke on the phone with you.
Why didn't you say anything?
Robert wrote in his will not to have a funeral and to keep it a secret for a while. The mother-in-law, who had been angry about not receiving the $6,000 allowance, fell silent after hearing my words. It's only natural to be lost for words upon hearing of your son's passing. In the silence that followed, I thought this was the case, but it seems it wasn't.
What a pity. I raised him with so much effort and money, thinking it was an investment. I was expecting to receive more money. Are you serious? Robert has passed away and those are the words you come up with? If he's gone, there's no need to mince words, right? Oh, and since I won't be getting Robert's $4,000 allowance anymore, remember, you and I had an agreement for a $2,000 allowance. Keep that up. Are you kidding me?
I found myself yelling at the unbelievable words of my mother-in-law and hung up the phone. This was her true nature. Though it left a bad taste in my mouth, this likely settled the issue of the high allowance for my mother-in-law. About this phone call. Actually, my name is Emily. I'm 28, a company employee, and about to get married. My fiancé, John, is 32 and a mechanic who does repairs and maintenance on factory machinery. We don't live together before marriage, so we're still living separately. However, I have a key to his apartment, so I can come and go as I please. Therefore, I often visit his place.
Welcome back. Oh, you smell again today. Dinner's ready, but why don't you take a bath first? I was gonna take a bath first without you saying.
To avoid dirtying the interior, my husband took off his socks at the entrance and lifted the hems of his pants so they wouldn't touch the floor as he headed to the bathroom. John always comes home smelling of sweat and oil. It's not a pleasant smell, but it's proof of his hard work, so it's not something to dislike. I'm a serious person and I like my hardworking fiancé.
Once we're done greeting your mother, let's start looking for a house to live in together. I've told you before, it's okay.
After John comes out of the bath, it's dinner time. Lately, I always talk about house hunting during dinner. I can't wait to start living together. John always replies to my confirmation with a bored look, but his mouth relaxes as he eats. He must be looking forward to living together too. Once we live together, we'll say goodbye to this cheap studio apartment he's been frequenting. It's small and inconvenient, but leaving it feels a bit sad. I look around the room, like a graduate looking back at the classroom they once occupied. Even though John is over 30, he's continued to live in this cheap, small studio, but it's not because he earns little. I once asked him why.
Hey, aren't you gonna move to a bigger place? Isn't it cramped and inconvenient here? Well, it's close to work and the rent is cheap. We can manage with the small space. Ah, I see, apart from the size, it's convenient then. Gotta save money, you know.
Robert is a saver. Not just on rent, but he also cuts corners on groceries, utility bills, and buys only the bare minimum of clothes. It's a bit stingy, but certainly better than being a spendthrift. I think a practical guy like him is good to marry. He's serious about work, sensible with money, and kind to me. So, I had no worries about marrying Robert. But, after meeting his mother, my anxiety about marriage suddenly grew. On the day we went to greet Robert's mother, I was nervous. Will it be okay? What if she doesn't like me?
Aren't you worrying too much? It'll be fine.
As we arrived at Robert's family home, my breathing became erratic. To calm down, I took a deep breath and sipped some water. There's a reason I was so nervous. Robert's mom divorced right after his birth. And after the divorce, his father disappeared, stopping child support payments. So, his mom raised Robert all by herself. The typical mother-in-law issue of feeling like her carefully raised son is being taken away seemed inevitable. Since she's a single parent, I really wanted to avoid any conflicts. To start a peaceful married life, it's crucial to make a good impression on her. After putting my water bottle back in my bag, I braced myself and entered Robert's family home.
So, you're Robert's fiancé? I don't like you.
Looks like a peaceful start to married life is off the table. We'd just made simple greetings at the entrance and were seated in the living room. It wasn't that I did something wrong, she just hadn't taken a liking to me from the start.
Mom, why would you say something like that right off the bat? We're gonna be family, no need for formalities, right? Plus, it's better to be upfront about these things. Mom, no matter what you say, I'm gonna marry her. I'm not opposing the marriage, okay? I'm just expressing my feelings. Don't worry.
A quiet parental argument unfolded before me. Feeling awkward, I fidgeted with my toes while sitting formally, hoping time would pass quickly.
What don't you like about Emily? She's just a mid-level company employee, not earning much, right?
I came to greet her for marriage, but the conversation was just between Robert and his mom. Butting in might worsen her impression of me. So, I left it to Robert. Still, being called low income irked me a bit. Sure, my salary isn't that high. But it's not low either, and I don't struggle with living expenses. Maybe she's just worried her son might struggle if he marries someone who might not contribute much financially?
Emily, despite what I said, my son is precious to me. Please take good care of him. Yes, I understand.
Finally, the hellish time that felt like 1 minute stretched to 10 was over. Though Robert's mother said she didn't like me, she wasn't opposed to our marriage and ended up saying she wished us well. She must be just concerned about her son. Thinking positively, I decided to work on deepening our relationship with her and stood up, my legs a bit numb.
Just a second, Robert.
As we were about to leave through the front door, Robert's mother called him back. I stopped too since she had stopped Robert.
It's okay, Emily. Wait outside.
I felt a bit left out and sad being treated like an outsider. But I figured there might be things for parents and children to discuss alone, so I quietly stepped out and closed the door. While waiting outside, I could hear fragments of Robert's conversation with his mother through the door.
Allowance. I understand.
It was hard to make out the full conversation. But I heard allowance. I hadn't known before, but it seemed Robert had been sending his mother money. But why did they need to send me away for a conversation about allowance? Did they think I would oppose it?
Sorry for making you wait. No, it's fine.
Though I was curious about the allowance discussion, it wasn't shared with me, so I couldn't ask Robert. I hadn't felt any anxiety about marrying him until this greeting with his mother, but now I started to feel some. Months later, Robert and I got married and started our married life. The anxiety I felt during that marriage greeting was completely blown away by our marital bliss. So much so, I had forgotten about the allowance conversation. But soon after we started living together, I was reminded of it.
This is how much I've saved up. What about you, Robert?
Well, Robert nervously placed his bank book on the table, like a child caught doing something wrong. How couples handle their savings from before marriage varies. We decided to treat our pre-marriage savings as joint funds. So, we were showing each other our bank books, but I was shocked when I saw Robert's.
What? There's hardly anything here. Why? You were so frugal. Well, I've been sending money to my mom.
Hearing allowance, I suddenly remembered the conversation between Robert and his mother during the marriage greeting. Allowance and an almost empty bank book. A feeling of unrest stirred in my chest. Now that I knew he was giving money to his mother, it was something that involved our joint finances. So, I felt no hesitation in asking.
The allowance is for your mom, right? How much are you sending?
$4,000 a month.
$4,000?
I was stunned by the amount, much higher than I expected. I never thought such a big issue would come up so soon after our marriage. Robert had started sending $600 a month when he first started working, but his mother gradually demanded more, and now it's $4,000 a month. Initially, his mother said she didn't need any allowance. But even then, Robert continued to send her money. Maybe she got used to living comfortably with the allowance. Despite being only 57 and still young, she quit her job and now only works part-time, relying entirely on Robert's allowance for her living expenses. After subtracting $4,000 from Robert's salary, we're left with just enough to cover the bare essentials. Now, I finally understood why he lived in a cheap apartment and bought so little.
Why do you keep up with such an unreasonable allowance? If it's tough, you could just say no or reduce it to a more manageable amount, right? No, well, my mom struggled to raise me until I graduated college, and I think money was tight, so when she asks, it's hard for me to say no.
As I gently placed Robert's bank book back on the table, he stared blankly at it and fell silent. It seems he couldn't refuse his mother's demands because of his gratitude for being raised and his overly kind nature. I think Robert is also responsible for not refusing his mother's requests. But hearing his story, it seems like his mother understands his sense of obligation and takes advantage of his kind nature. I spoke to Robert, who looked dejected like a scolded child, in as gentle a tone as possible.
I think it's good to take care of your mother, but the current relationship isn't healthy. Yeah, you're right, it isn't healthy.
Robert picked up his bank book, flipping through it with a sigh. It seemed he understood that his relationship with his mother couldn't continue this way. But given his personality and the future relationship with his mother, suddenly stopping the allowance or reducing it back to the initial $600 seemed difficult.
Could you gradually reduce the allowance amount? Yeah, I'll talk to my mom about it next time I call her.
Robert left the living room to put away his bank book, looking somewhat diminished. 3 days after the high allowance was revealed, Robert still hadn't contacted his mother. I wanted him to call her soon, but I understood that asking his mother to reduce the allowance must require a lot of courage for him. So, I couldn't rush him. However, before long, his mother took the initiative.
Hello, Emily? I have a small favor to ask. I'm about to go back to work after my break. It's okay, this will be quick. Actually, I've been getting an allowance from my son. I heard from Robert the other day.
His mother had called to tell me she was receiving an allowance from him. She probably figured that sooner or later, I'd find out she was getting $4,000 a month. So she decided to confess first to mitigate my anger and try to keep the amount from being reduced. Her timing during my lunch break also seemed calculated, as being short on time might prevent me from making a calm decision. I began to understand why Robert couldn't stand up to his mother. She was more cunning than I had thought, and bolder than I had imagined.
So, you know about the allowance. That makes it easier. Since Robert is married and you're working, the household income has increased, right? So, I was thinking, maybe you could increase the allowance amount. Robert's already giving me $4,000, so how about another $2,000 from your salary? What?
I blurted out loud, attracting glances from my coworkers. Embarrassed, I apologized to them while still on the phone with his mother.
That's impossible, you know? Is it? Then maybe I should ask Robert for another $2,000? Wait! What are you thinking?
I raised my voice again, apologizing to my coworkers once more. That's why she was concerned about my income at the marriage greeting.
But if you won't pay, I guess I'll have to ask Robert. All right, I'll handle it. But not this month, please start from next month. Thank you, that helps.
I hung up the phone, tasting a deep sense of defeat. I had given in to her demands, cornered by a phone call during my work break and her using Robert as leverage. I had fallen right into her trap. That night, I told Robert about the call and her demand for an increased allowance.
What? Mom called Emily? And she asked you for an allowance too? I'm sorry, Robert. You said you'd try to reduce the allowance, but now I've agreed to increase it. No, Emily, you don't have to apologize. What is Mom thinking?
I apologized to Robert, feeling a bit relieved. He usually becomes meek when it comes to his mother, but he showed anger when he heard she had demanded an allowance from me. This was a good sign, as it might mean he would stand up to her. However, that positive turn was short-lived. The company's gonna go bankrupt. The next evening, as Robert returned from work, he staggered towards me like a zombie and reported in a lifeless voice that made me question my ears. I was left speechless, my hands frozen in the middle of preparing dinner. We're newlyweds, and with the issues with his mother, what terrible timing. I thought, why now? But in these times, a company going bankrupt is not unheard of. Robert, who had worked diligently, wasn't to blame. I decided to redirect my disappointment towards the country's inability to escape recession and stimulate economic growth. This changes things. The next day, I called my mother-in-law. About increasing the allowance to $6,000 from next month, could you wait a little?
Why? What happened?
Well, Robert's company is going bankrupt. Considering the future, I'd like to wait a bit before increasing the allowance.
Eh? But Emily, you promised to increase it to $6,000 from next month, right?
The situation has changed, so please.
I feel sorry for my son, but you made a promise. Even if he loses his job, you have some savings, right? Plus, Robert will get severance pay, unemployment benefits, layoff notice allowances, right?
But still. I tried to resist, but she wouldn't accept my request. I thought about telling Robert, but he was in a daze from the shock of unemployment. I couldn't bring up the allowance. Pondering what to do, I watched Robert's listless face staring at the TV. Why does she still demand an allowance when her son is unemployed? As I watched Robert, feeling weaker by the moment, anger slowly began to rise within me, thinking back to the phone conversation with my mother-in-law. A month after Robert's unemployment. It was time for the $6,000 allowance, but I transferred only $4,000. Of course, my money-hungry mother-in-law called that night.
I checked the bank account. Why is the allowance only $4,000 this month? Didn't you say it would be $6,000?
She must have been looking forward to the $2,000 increase. Her anger was palpable. But there was a reason I could only send $4,000. I had to tell her the truth. Robert has passed away, so there will be no more allowances.
What? What are you saying? There's $4,000 here.
I know it's hard to believe. But it's true. Robert became mentally ill after the company's bankruptcy and took his own life. The $4,000 this time was due to the bank's automatic transfer service he used, which I couldn't cancel in time.
No way. Is it true? When?
About a week after our last phone call.
Why didn't you tell me?
Robert wrote in his will not to have a funeral and to keep it secret for a while. We had a direct burial. He must have felt ashamed to end his life after 30. He wrote in his will to tell others it was a subarachnoid hemorrhage, but I wanted to tell you the truth. She fell silent. All I could hear was the faint sound of the TV from her house. Losing her son must have left her speechless. She might also regret making Robert send her high allowances. During the silent moment, I thought that, but it seems I was mistaken.
By the way, wasn't Robert insured? Since there was no funeral, there should be some money left, right? Isn't that money for me? What? I invested time and money in raising him, hoping to get more back. I thought I'd still be able to get some money. Are you serious? Your son has died, and these are the words you come up with? If he's gone, there's no need to be careful with words, right? Oh, and since I won't get Robert's $4,000 anymore, we had agreed on $2,000 from you, so keep that up. Don't be ridiculous. I found myself yelling at the unbelievable words of my mother-in-law and hung up the phone. This was her true nature. It left a bitter taste in my mouth, but this should resolve the allowance issue with her. A week after the unpleasant call with my mother-in-law. The doorbell rang early in the morning. Hurry up and open the door. When I answered the intercom, her face filled the screen, yelling at me. But I responded calmly, without any surprise. I'm coming, please don't yell. I stopped the toaster I was using to make toast and leisurely headed to the front door. Perhaps I was too slow, as my impatient mother-in-law started banging on the door and shouting. What are you doing? Open up. I opened the door with a feeling of annoyance, and there she stood, looking furious. You lied. I heard that Robert is working as usual. About Robert? Yes, the part about him passing away was a lie. What? My mother-in-law was taken aback by my blunt admission of the lie, looking foolishly surprised. I never intended to keep up the lie that Robert had died, it was just to deceive her over the phone. Therefore, Robert has been living his life without hiding. He's found a new job and leaves for work every morning, and he communicates normally with acquaintances and friends. Probably, my mother-in-law heard from someone else that Robert was alive. She must feel quite embarrassed for misunderstanding that her own son had died. Why would you tell such a lie? It was to confirm your true nature. Robert, having no need to hide, also came to the entrance. I heard the last phone call too. What did you say? I listened to that conversation. About not needing to be considerate anymore, and about the preliminary investment. Hearing her mention of the preliminary investment, Robert glared at her. His expression, one I had never seen before,
intimidated my mother-in-law, and her earlier bravado completely vanished. Robert had always been a bit weak when it came to his mother, but now he stood confidently. Just as I had planned. I couldn't bear the idea of my disheartened, unemployed husband being pressured for more allowance by his mother. Initially, I intended to gradually reduce the allowance, but I decided to stop it altogether. Robert had already promised to try reducing the allowance. Considering his character and his relationship with his mother, it must have taken courage. Encouraged by my words, he mustered that courage, and I thought if I pushed a little more, we could stop the allowance altogether. So, my plan was to pretend Robert had died, expose my mother-in-law's true nature, and have Robert confirm it. It was a disrespectful plan, I know. But if things continued, it would ruin Robert's life. So, I was prepared to be seen as the villain for executing this plan.
So, I was raised as an investment for money. No, that was just a metaphor, an example. Really? Then what did you mean by preliminary investment?
My mother-in-law was desperately trying to find a way out. Looking around for any hint. Unfortunately for her, no matter what counterargument she tried to come up with, she had few cards to play.
So, you repay the kindness of being raised by betraying me like this. What a terrible son and daughter-in-law.
I glared at her, mentally cheering. The old Robert might have backed down when confronted with his debt of being raised. But now, knowing her true nature, that tactic wouldn't work on him. And I had prepared for this card.
Any debt of being raised has long been repaid. What? Robert attended public schools from elementary to university, right? The cost of raising a child in such cases is about $140,000. Robert has been sending allowances for 10 years. It started at $600, then $1,000, $1,400, $2,000, and now $4,000. The total sum of the allowances so far is $216,000. If his upbringing was an investment, then you've already profited by over $60,000. Isn't that enough?
My mother-in-law seemed at a loss for words. All she could do was open and close her mouth like a fish, with no sound coming out. This was also information I had researched on the internet to help push Robert's back. Thinking about how his mother had spent effort and money on raising him, my kind-hearted husband couldn't push her away. So, I told Robert about the amount of money spent on him and how he had already paid back more than that. Realizing he had already repaid his debt in numbers, it seems Robert was able to clear his mind of any obligation towards his mother.
From next month on, we're not sending any allowance. Wait a minute. That's not fair. How will I live without it? You're still 57, right? You can work plenty. But work at this age, after all this time.
My mother-in-law tried to argue, but seeing Robert's firm stance, she seemed to give up. Her voice fading and eventually falling silent. This was the outcome I had hoped for. It would have been okay for me to refuse the allowance. But if I did, she might still try to get money from Robert behind my back. So, it was necessary for Robert himself to refuse it.
I have plans with Emily today. If we're done here, can you leave? And don't contact us again. It's always about money with you anyway.
Robert pushed my mother-in-law out of the entrance, closed the door with force, and immediately locked it. It seemed she had realized she couldn't change the situation, as her footsteps receded from the other side of the door.
I'm going back to preparing breakfast.
I returned to the kitchen and resumed toasting the bread. Robert, as he said, firmly stopped the allowance. My mother-in-law, who had been relying on the allowance for living, had to start job hunting, as part-time work wasn't enough. But with a nearly 10-year gap and nearing 60, it seemed she couldn't find a job. Moreover, it appeared she had spent the allowance she received from Robert every month, leaving her with no savings. Now, she's juggling 4 part-time jobs, working from morning till night. Had she shown even a hint of remorse when I said Robert had died, I might have continued the allowance a bit. But she called his upbringing a preliminary investment. She had a chance but failed to seize it, and her tough life now is her own doing. Robert has no intention of caring for her in her old age. Starting to prepare for retirement at 57 with no savings will be tough, so she'll have to work hard. As for us, we're enjoying our newlywed life. Robert has become brighter since the burden of the allowance was lifted. Also, having the courage to stand up to his mother has seemingly made him a bit more rugged. I've grown to love him even more. Eager to see my beloved husband, I'm hurrying home from work today.